the Relaxed Running Podcast.
I can edit this part out if it's not a place you want to start from, but I was keen to pick your brain around your book.
Yeah, it's been an interesting one. So for the last 12 years now, I've been making videos on the topic of running. And like I started just having conversations just like you've been doing, just with people that you respect, people that you can learn from, and you just have an open dialogue on the topic of running, the topic of health. You and I have several different podcast guests in common. I saw like Dr. MAF, Mark Allen, Lawrence Van Lingen, like Charlie Angle. There's like quite a few people in common. I just noticed after having some of these conversations, there were always nuggets in there that I sometimes would listen a second time or a third time, even while editing some of these conversations, because I put a video version up, I put like an audio version up. And so I actually listened to these conversations multiple times. And every time I would listen, I would pick up other nuggets again. And yes, for myself, I started making notes in the back end of like, this stood out to me, that stood out to me. And before I noticed, I had like hundreds of pages of notes. And so this was one of those things. So I was like, gee, it would be really nice, even for myself, to just be able to sit on the couch one day and have a printed version of all of this stuff together in actually legitimately well-organized like chapters. And so this is where the idea started brewing a few years ago. And then like I learned quite a few things in my own running journey too. Like I started like doing running coaching probably about 7-8 years ago. And from there on, we've worked with thousands of athletes and a lot of commonalities in like these recreational runners that just had certain breakthroughs in their running. And I was like, well, there's a lot of things that I've learned over the years. Like if I would have had this book 10 years ago when I just got into it, or 12 years ago when I really started, it would have fast-tracked a lot of things. So at this point, slowly but surely, this is not like, hey, let's go sit down for X amount of time and write a book. Like this has literally been years and years of collecting notes over time. I have like Evernote documents, Google documents. And now I was like, all right, I hired like an editor who was actually legitimate about the whole writing process, about setting something up in a structured way. And like gradually, slowly but surely in the back end, that has been evolving. And yeah, it's been a big learning process, to say the least. I almost see it as like this has been my next mental training chapter, as in like not training for a marathon, but it's like actually training for like being able to sit down and actually like focus and concentrate, which is easier said than done some of these days.
For sure. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Man, let me show you something. Give me 1 sec. I'll get it.
Yeah.
I remember when I was about 15, I got gifted this book for Christmas. I don't know if you can see that. Top Distance of the Century. And I don't know what happened. I went through a minimalist phase years ago and I got rid of this book. And I was so spewing because I was like, it was such a great insight into like a certain period of a number of athletes' training and life. And anyway, a guy that I was coaching for a little over a year, Mark, who I think actually put me onto you originally, came to my Falls Creek running camp here in Victoria last year. And when he rocked up, he knocked on my door and he goes, mate, I got this present for you. And I couldn't believe it because I'd been looking online and I don't know what websites I was looking at, but you were paying like hundreds of dollars for this book. So he did some research. Anyway, I bring it up because exactly what you said, I seriously have been thinking for a long time. It would be amazing if someone did like an updated version of some really good thoughts in and around the world of training. So hearing you explain it has got me really excited because, full disclosure to everyone, I had no idea about the book till just now. And so, I mean, it's like a nice coffee table book that you can sit back, as you say, and just, tap into so many hundreds of conversations that you've had and just peel back some nuggets of wisdom. So I can imagine it's going to be a little bit of a work in progress for a little while. Have you got any idea on release date yet?
It's kind of an interesting one because I'm like Mr. Optimist when it comes to timelines. And I've just realized that some of these timelines are just not realistic. As in, like, you think, project this takes long. And like, just like with running, you can't rush through some of this stuff, right? Like if you really want to progress in your running in the long term, like going about it gradually versus like trying to rush through it. Like, so to be honest, no, I don't. As in, I would like it to come out in 2025. But I know, like, even once I hand over a copy to an editor, it will still take several months to go through, and from there on, yeah, it's a process. It really is. So.
Yeah. I relate to you with that regard. Like, I actually said this to my wife last night. I've got a bit of a reputation for going, okay, I have an idea, and from like the idea being planted to the idea being in action has to be the shortest possible turnaround. And as a result, sometimes I feel like I let myself down a little bit on quality. And it's like almost a breath of fresh air when you can step back and go, okay, well, I'm going to just expand that horizon a little bit and allow the work to get done. Yeah, there's a part of my brain initially that hates that experience, but I know when it comes to the actual quality, I'll be thankful for it later.
Yeah, it's such a fine line, right? Because you also want to watch out with certain projects that at some point you just got to get it done, and you got to be comfortable that it's never going to be perfect. About a decade ago, I did Seth Godin, one of the marketing guys I really respect. I did his alt MBA program. And in that, in like a short period of time, 3 times a week, you had to ship a project, meaning you had to work for several hours with a few other people on it, and you had to present it and launch it that night. And you really got to learn how to put projects out in the world that weren't completely finished or that you weren't 100% ready with. And I think you might have noticed it for the podcast as well. Like, it takes quite a bit of time. Like, you take some of these work projects so personal, you want it to be the best way possible, but at some point you start to like try to make it perfect, and it just at the end of the day, whether you ship it at 90% or 95%, for most people it's not going to make that much of a difference. So at some point, just getting it out in the world and moving on. So
man, so good. I'm listening to Keith Richards, the lead guitarist for the Rolling Stones, autobiography at the moment, and he was talking about when the song "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" came out. He said they'd recorded some version of what he thought was a rusty version, and they were going to come back to it and refine it and really clean it up. And he said they were traveling through America as a band, listening to the radio, and the song came on as the number 1 song in America that week. And Keith was like, "What the fuck is going on, boys? I thought we..." And they were laughing. And he talked about that because he said a lot of the time, you can get to the other extreme where it's exactly what you said. You can start polishing something until it doesn't need to be shined anymore. And sometimes, like, as a result of that polishing, you can wear off a little bit of the authenticity in it. And yeah, it's a really good point as well. It's just that classic, I guess it's that classic balance. There's like a sweet spot in between. That seems to come across in the way that you have your conversations as well, because I think the conversations I click with a lot, whether it's running or not running related, is when it's like an authentic conversation where you can tap into the sort of heart of what it is that's sort of inspiring someone to do something. Has that sort of been a theme that you've cultivated over the years, or have you always been the kind of guy who likes to go into the heart of whether it's training or whatever the theme of the conversation is?
Yeah, I think it sometimes depends a little bit on who the guest is, meaning like about 1/3 of the guests on my show are recreational runners, where we just speak about like, what are some of the things that you've learned in your training and in your racing, and how have you improved? And I think it's quite relatable to people to not only hear from like the elite athletes, but hear from the everyday runners who also have full-time jobs, who have kids, who are trying to balance it all, right? But like, those kind of conversations are super conversational. But then when I would sit down, for example, with like an Elliot Kipchoge or a Kilian Jornet or a Courtney Dauwalter, at that point, I feel to get the most out of those conversations, yes, there's that personal element. But sometimes I'm like, I'm only going to have an hour time that I'm sitting down with this person, or like an hour and a half time. Like, I do want to make sure that I prepare those questions properly, that when things come about. So I literally would take 20 hours of research before a conversation like that, to read their book, to watch their previous interviews, and I think a lot of people don't realize that some of those things really do take effort. And yes, you can outsource that, but that's the part that I enjoy the most, because that's where I think you get to learn. You get to read the materials that they have read, including some of the smaller interviews that not everyone might have seen. Because I I think as an interviewer, you don't want to just keep asking the same questions either that a lot of other people have asked. So I think finding kind of unique angles, or finding, like, here's one example. I sat down with Eliud Kipchoge in Tokyo for the Tokyo Marathon, and he had just ran the worst race of his life, and he was really down and bummed. And instead of me, like, the first day he canceled the interview, he didn't want to do any interviews. And so I was just being flexible. I was out there. And then the next day he did want to meet. But instead of me going up and asking, hey, what happened during the Tokyo Marathon? I just walked up to him and I just said, like, hey, here's a drawing that my kids made for you. And like, from one photo to another, like, my kids are a huge fan of you. And here's a drawing. And it's my family all running together with you, holding hands. And we're having a lot of fun together. So thanks for inspiring my kids. And it's like, boom, instantly you like kind of level the playing field, and everyone is like, it's not like, here's a celebrity or runner who like bonked at a race and we're going to try to dig holes in why that happened. It's like, no, let's just be two humans in the same room and having a conversation. So
yeah, it's really cool. How do you go emotionally with interviews like that? Like, one thing I've learned over the course of the last 4 or 5 years of doing this podcast is there's certain guests that I've held on a pedestal for quite a long time. And it always blows my mind when you get the opportunity just to sit down and look at them and have a conversation. And there's definitely, it's a different game going on. Like, obviously you've got the subject matter that you want to talk about. And then you've got like the emotional game that you're trying to deal with. Like, all right, how do I speak to this person and get the information and not make it weird and uncomfortable? And like, I'm in the world of stand-up comedy. And so I'm constantly dealing with overcoming nerves and trying to navigate my way through or just awkward situations. And I think that's been really helpful. But it's always one thing, because you look very relaxed when you're conducting an interview. But I always know that people say that about me sometimes as well. And I know that in moments that they might point out that I seem relaxed, I go, I was pretty anxious.
you know what's interesting? I think it when you gain more experience, you become more comfortable doing it. When I look back at one of my very first interviews was with Dr. Phil Maffetone, and I just improved. Like, I just sent an email to him. This was right off, very close after that alt MBA program. I kind of like got comfortable just getting out of my shell, reaching out to people and just kind of saying, like, getting no's and being okay with that. So I just sent an email to him and I was like, hey, here's 18 months of my training data. Like, I improved my MAF pace by several minutes, and here's a monthly breakdown. And I was like, I would love to have a conversation with you. I'm starting a little podcast. I think it might be interesting. So he sent a message and he actually said, like, yeah, sure, let's do it. And I was like, whoa, this is kind of interesting. So I prepared several different questions because I was nervous. I didn't have much interview experience. And I remember at the beginning, I would ask a question and he would start answering. And I would be so nervous that I would already try to like, look, what is the next question to ask? I wouldn't even hear what he was saying. And then like, I look back at that video and I cringe. I'm like, I can't believe how nervous I was in that conversation, right? And then that video ended up getting 200,000 plus views, and it like his answers were really good. Like, yes, I look like an absolute idiot, but at least I made that first step doing it, and I grew throughout the process. Over the years, I've interviewed him and others several times, and it becomes more of a dialogue. You can actually hear what the other person is saying. And I think, like with everything, right? The first time you run a marathon, it's a scary new experience. You've never done it. And then you do it a second time, you know what it's like to get to 32K in a race. And you know what it's like to get to mile 20. And so I think the more you do some of these things, the easier it gets. So.
Yeah, man, it is cool. I relate to that experience of sending a Hail Mary email and getting a response that you weren't expecting. It's always nice to open those. So you were a couple of years into your running journey when you decided to launch the podcast?
Yes, correct.
And you got into it, it sounded like pretty immediately you jumped on board the MAF method.
It was 2013 that my daughter was born, and I was kind of an out of shape guy. I was working in the action sports industry, which was, at the time, I was a marketing director for a company called Volcom, like an apparel brand. And it was like 200 days out of the year, I was traveling. There was a lot of partying, a lot of drinking, and I was just well out of shape. And so I always got injured with skateboarding, and I started running more consistent at that time. once my daughter was born, and I was like, I don't want to be an out of shape dad. And it was really at that point in 2013 that I first heard of a podcast on Trail Runner Nation, one of our friends, Scott and Don over here, and they interviewed Dr. Phil Maffetone. And that's when I heard the whole concept of like slow down to speed up and like low heart rate training. And once I tried that, I actually, for the first time in my life, actually found joy in my running. Meaning like, oh, you can actually run slower and actually still become faster over time and finish a workout and not feel like you're about to die. And like, it was an entire different approach that I was like, why did I always feel you had to push yourself so hard in order to improve in your running? Whereas like actually taking a more gentle approach, especially as you're a dad and you're busy, or like just anyone really, but there was already a lot of things going on in personal life that this was actually became more of a relaxing activity. So yeah, that was 2013 when I first got introduced to that, and pretty quickly after that, like probably in 2014, I started recording videos and podcasts.
Yeah, you're a bit of an OG in the world of the running podcast world at the moment. Like anyone who's been hosting a podcast for a decade they got on board relatively early, hey?
Yeah, it's kind of funny though. I would say I'm probably the least consistent podcaster, meaning some periods I've had that I would do a weekly podcast, and sometimes I've literally had like no new episode for 3 months, and I just didn't have the bandwidth to pull it off. So it was kind of interesting that way. But I think do what you can, and like whenever it feels right to do, like do it. So
Yeah, for sure. It's been interesting for me, who's a lot newer to not necessarily the MAF method. Like that's, I wouldn't say I've necessarily completely adopted it. Like obviously, zone 2 training has been a little bit of a theme, whether I've known it or not, for quite a while. I think it's become a lot more of a focus theme in the last couple of years. But I mean, even 2014, that was when I finished competitive running. I was like a track and field athlete. I was probably, my best event was 3,000 meters. And so like the intensity part of the training was always focused on, I think, more with the groups that I was training with. But then coming back to running after like 7 years off competing, I'd noticed almost immediately there was a real trend on this subject that I'd actually never heard of before. Like 2014, I don't think I'd heard anyone say the phrase zone 2 training, do you know, which is sort of funny because I know we've both spoken to people like Mark Allen and especially Maffetone who have been, or Maffetone's been speaking about this since the 70s. So it's strange how it sort of comes in and out of fashion. But I mean, anything on Zone 2 on YouTube at the moment, it's a real trending topic with the algorithm.
it really is. And I think what's funny is in 2013-14, when I started making some videos on that topic, a lot of people would be quite negative in the comments, as in like there was a lot of pushback on the topic, and I was kind of like just sharing like, hey, this is what worked for me, like not telling anyone else to do it, but this is what has worked well for me. And then some other people were sharing some of their positive experiences. I started a little Facebook group that has grown to like 8,000 people over the years, and it was just people sharing experiences, and that just naturally, like, you hear what's working, what's not working. I think one of the biggest things with any training approach is, just like with MAF training, there's some people who follow things very rigorously, and it's like 180 minus your age, that is the heart rate you should be running at. And that works well for some people, and it doesn't work that well for other people, meaning some people have a high max heart rate. It will be different for them. Some people are in the 50s or 60s or 70s, and the formula needs to be adjusted. And so I think the general concept, whether you do that through a zone 2 calculator, whether you do that through a talk test, whether you go to a lactate threshold test in a lab, or like, I think the general concept of slowing down in the majority of your runs and actually being able to have a conversational pace to actually develop your aerobic system well, to not always have such high training stress from like going pedal to the metal all day long. I think that concept is so good. And yes, I don't agree with all of the different elements from MAF training, but I think you take the good, what works well for you and what you've seen work well, and then you adjust that to your own kind of situation. I think no athlete is alike. And I think the flexibility on the day-to-day is so important. Like a few weeks ago, I sat down with Courtney DeWalter in Leadville, and we had a conversation about how she goes about her training. And I loved her answers. She said, I sit down in the morning with a cup of coffee. And while I drink that cup of coffee, I just check in with my body. How am I feeling? How are my energy levels? Do I have any niggles, anything feeling off? And based on that, she'll decide how she'll train that day. And I really like that approach. I see too many times where athletes just grab a training schedule and proudly tell you, I followed this 18-week schedule to the teeth, did every workout. I'm like, God, I wish you would have been a little bit more flexible. But then again, some people have more consistent lives maybe than I do. But I know when my daughter is partying at 3 a.m. or throwing up or coming into my bedroom, that my morning workout might have to get adjusted. So.
Oh man, for sure. I'm not kidding. Last night, I reckon I had an hour sleep. I think I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and we've got into some bad habits with the 2-year-old, and as a result, now we're doing some sleep training. And anyway, yeah, I woke up this morning and I was like, thank God today wasn't scheduled for a hard session. I've got nothing to say no to that's really hard to say no to. But yeah, you're right. I used to have a coach, Adam Diddick, who's also a really good friend of mine, who he would often say when he wrote a training program that just remember that all of this is written in pencil. And it really stuck with me because for exactly the reason you said. I'm probably one of those guys that 10 years ago, I would have come up to you with the 18-week program and said, hey, Flo, I didn't miss a beat. You know what I mean? And I would have had the injuries and fatigue to prove it. And so, yeah, I think that's been, maybe it's an age thing. Like, I don't know how old you are. I'm 37 now. And I think, as you say,
I'm 42, so absolutely.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, it's really interesting. I look back at my younger self and I'm like, oh, that's what people mean when they say you got to listen to your elders. But I'm at that, you're getting older when you start speaking like that. But man, it's true. Yeah, dude. So you were 2 years in, pretty much, or you started running 2013, got involved in the MAF method, and your headspace was just get healthy. Like you weren't coming at it with the intention of going, all right, I'm out here to break records, or like what was your headspace really?
Well, the funny thing is, I ran my first marathon in 2007, and that was a horrific experience. Meaning, like everything that could potentially go wrong went wrong with that. Meaning, like it was inconsistency in the training, didn't really know what I was doing. Everything was at a mediocre intensity, feeling pretty beat about it. But then on race day too, at the time I worked here in America for a skateboarder named Tony Hawk, and we had a world premiere for his video the night before, and I thought it was a good idea to let's be the one in charge of this whole event until 2-3 in the morning in Hollywood, and then drive back home and then sleep a few hours and then run a marathon. And it was just one of those coming to mile 20, like 32K in, and just thinking you're going to die and having to beg someone on the side of the course for like a Gatorade, try to like have this depth march to the finish. And so that was my thing of like, that was 2007. And so I didn't run for like 6 years, any races. It was really like inconsistent after that. But I knew that I could do better if I would go about the training smarter and have some type of race day strategy. And so then once I started training consistent and with joy, I was just able to build up my volume consistently. I was able to build up, not get injured. Like that was another thing. And yeah, with that consistency, all of a sudden I started noticing my aerobic pace drop further and further. And so I went from a 4:11 was my first marathon. Then my second marathon was a 2 hours 55. So I shaved off like 76 minutes from one marathon to another. I was like, oh, there's something about this. And then I qualified for the Boston Marathon, then ran the Boston Marathon in 2 hours 44 in like really horrendous weather. I was like, without carbon plated shoes or anything. I was like, oh, there's something about this. So, and then real life happened, meaning like 2 young kids and all of that. And I think at some point it becomes this thing that I started shifting my mindset of like, instead of trying to go always after better time, like to run like some of these personal bests, you had to do a lot of training volume. Yet instead, it was like, I don't want to train 70, 80 miles a week for like whatever, 10, 12 hours if I have 2 young kids at home and a busy job. So at some point I was like, okay, I think I can get away with running about 5-6 hours a week and being creative with some of the strength training, some of these other things, and then just see what can I do on race day with that, not having to aim for like a personal best, but just doing what you could in that situation. And so it kind of just became this balancing game in different ways that way.
That's a really cool flexibility. The word flexibility sort of comes to mind when I hear you speak, which is I actually had I can't, is it Ali Ostrander? I always forget her last name. She's a YouTuber from America. I only found out about her recently, but like she's quite prominent in the world of YouTube. She's very charismatic. Like the conversation was so fun. She was very honest, like very real. You could tell she wasn't putting on a show. She was just there being Ali. And yeah, one thing that stood out in that conversation with her is like she's a professional athlete. For an example, for anyone who hasn't heard of her, she's aiming next year to qualify for the world trail running team, like the US trail running team and the US steeple team. And she was saying, yeah, I run 4 days a week or 5 days a week, and I cross train on the other days, and my Strava miles like looks like this. And he goes, she said, I always get people coming up to me and being like, don't you think that your game would go to the next level if you just had your Strava miles high like this? And she's like, yeah, I don't know, maybe, but I just like I find it too boring if I do that. She's like, then there's something so refreshing about hearing an elite athlete take that approach, or hearing you mention Courtney Dauwalter talk about her morning coffee and body scan. I go, okay, that's something that's overlooked. And I've been speaking to a number of people on here about wearables and data, and how it's like a new game to play with, and it is fun. It's exciting. There's some I use it. Some really cool data points, but it's that weird balance, isn't it? Of like some people go full data, some people go full feel. Like again, that middle path seems to be the one to walk if you want to get the best of both
100%. I think the one part that I do truly enjoy about data, and I've seen this firsthand with myself, but I see this quite frequently with people just getting into like a heart rate training program. You become more aware of what's happening in your body, meaning I think some people are pretty out of tune with what's going on. That connection between body and mind, it's pretty off. But I think once you start noticing, like, okay, if I do a hard workout and like in the morning, my resting heart rate might be elevated by 5 beats, or my heart rate variability might be a lot lower. After a while, you start recognizing certain patterns, and you start to recognize how your body actually feels when your data is saying certain things too. And so I've found that to be quite eye-opening sometimes. Like sometimes I feel really tired, and then I look, and most often the data from my watch or from my Aura ring would be pretty accurate with that. Sometimes it's off. You don't want to 100% always follow it to that degree. But I think I've literally seen that my Aura ring would tell me like, hey, your heart rate variability is way off, like step back. And it wasn't until the next day that I started feeling a cold coming up or something. So there is something to be said. Sometimes even the data shows it before the body can even recognize the signals. At the other hand, people go way overboard with it. So it's just fine line between the two, I think. So.
Yeah. What kind of data are you usually tuning into? Is it sort of sleep and HRV and heart rate in general, or are there any other? I found this interesting because I feel lately everyone that I speak to about this question, there's a couple in common, and there's always a curveball where I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, interesting.
For me, sleep, it's kind of this most important overarching part, right? Like I had a conversation with Matteo. He's the CEO and founder of 8 Sleep. So they make this cooling mattress, and just took a deep dive on the topic of sleep. And he brought up that topic as well, as in like, without sleep, your exercise is going to be out of the window and your nutrition is going to be out of the window. Like, yes, you can optimize everything in the world with nutrition and exercise, but if your sleep is poor, good luck. Your body is just not going to function well. Whereas if you sleep really good and you don't exercise and you eat like crap, you still feel relative okay. And so this is where, to me, like sleep is kind of the North Star, which is easier said than done sometimes. But I think at least even from a like trying not to go to bed with too much of a gap in between, like going to bed at midnight the one night and going to bed at 8 o'clock the other night. I try to at least be somewhat consistent in there. But then again, real life is happening, right? Like it's just one of those. But outside of sleep, I do look at resting heart rate. That one is pretty eye-opening to me. And there's so many different data variables that you can get that from, whether you do that manually, where you just in the morning at the same time measure it, whether you look at your watch, your ring, whatever data you want to look at there. And then I think heart rate variability is an interesting one. And once again, you can find numerous ways to measure that. Even if you have, for example, an iPhone with one of the lights on there, like just putting your finger on there, it can measure it within 30 seconds with some of these apps. And you get a relative accurate heart rate variability data. So you don't need like expensive gadgets for it either. And once you know what your baseline is, for example, with the resting heart rate, let's say my average resting heart rate is 40. And like you look in the morning and it's more than 4 or 5 beats off, I know I got to back off. I know something is either up with my sleep, with my stress levels, with something else. So I might just dial back the running intensity. I might dial back the running duration, or I might just skip a day of training. But very often it's not just the running component that's happening. It's often looking at some of these other things outside of the running too. Like everything is really connected there.
Sure. So in terms of family stresses, work stresses, just insert whatever it is. And are you running Extramilest full time? Is that work for you? I know you're in the Chorus office at the moment. I don't know if there's any affiliation there or.
No, it's kind of funny. Like I have a full-time running clothing company. Like that's my main, like, I'm one of the co-founders of Path Projects, running clothing brand. So we're a direct-to-consumer company here in the US. We've been around for about 6 years. That's what I do full-time. So I'm the head of marketing for there. We're currently like 4 co-founders. We work with like 5 different agencies. And yeah, we've been doing that for a while now. And then Extramilest, the podcast, and then the Personal Best program, those are like, I'm super passionate and excited about those. And I'm still actively involved in that on a daily basis. For me, it's a way to have a very close finger on the pulse of what's happening in the running community. It's a great way for me to have conversations with other creators in the space, or with, just like you, with coaches or with athletes. And I think you just learn a lot from sharing different ideas that way.
Yeah, for sure. I was admiring your hat before. I'm not sure if that's one of your company's hats.
It is actually one of our hats. We put that together with Kafuzi, one of our friends, Mike Coe from Chicago.
Yeah.
And so it has all the world majors at the bottom. It's got all the 6 world majors. We soon have to add the Sydney one to there as well. So
yeah, come on. Yeah, for anyone listening, the black hat with white writing that says non-elite, which I think I qualify for. Yeah, really, really good, man. So what does training look like for you at the moment, like in and around everything that you're doing?
It's kind of an interesting one. So I've ran about, in the last 12 years, I've ran about 50 marathons, several 50-milers, 100-miler, 50Ks.
Did you say 15 marathons or 50?
50.
Wow.
And so this year I ran Tokyo Marathon as my 5th world major and London as my 6th world major. So at the time of recording, there's only 6 world majors. Like, yeah, this next August is going to be the 7th. But so after I finished like the world majors, I honestly was a little bit burned out on the whole running part of always running road, like pretty like consistent with training schedules. And I've always found a lot of joy in trail running, meaning no rules, like just going out on the trails. I grew up skateboarding, and I see there's a lot of similarities between skateboarding and trail running. Just feeling very free, feeling like you can just go wherever you want and there's no one else watching you, there's no rules. And so like I've been really drawn to trail running more and more lately, where it's just like I'll just go out for an hour in the morning and I will like leave at sunrise, run for half an hour, 45 minutes, sit on a rock, meditate for like 15 minutes, and then just run back. And that's the beginning of my day. And it just feels right. It's like no training schedule, no nothing. And some days I feel like running really hard, and some days I feel like running not that hard. Like my next race, I don't really have a race on the calendar, but the beginning of the year, I always do an adventure, sometimes solo, sometimes with friends. So on January 1st, a few of my friends were meeting in Newport Beach at 6:30 in the morning. It's one of the local beaches here. We're going to run barefoot to Huntington Beach, one of the other beaches. And what we do is every jetty in between, so all of the rocks that go out in the ocean, we have to swim around them. So it's literally like a cold plunge times 10 or 12 while running barefoot. And it's just friends having a chat and having a laugh. And we come back and then we'll eat some donuts and drink some non-alcoholic beer. Or some guys will be drinking regular beer. And that's the beginning of the new year. But I think it doesn't have to be another road marathon, right? It's like what excites you to do. And I think leaning into that part. And sometimes that changes with the season. Sometimes you're just in a different stage of life. And like recently got really into pickleball with the family. And now we've been enjoying like just playing some pickleball tournaments. And it's like, I think the importance of play and mixing things up and not year after year after year doing the same routes, the same runs, and having to sign up for another race. Like if you enjoy doing that, by all means do that. But sometimes it's okay to mix up the terrain and the activities. So.
That's really cool. It's amazing how seasons can change the meaning of that. I hear that run you're going to do in January in Australia. I go, it sounds quite appealing in January. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, what are the water temperatures we're talking about? Where are you? Sorry.
I'm like south of Los Angeles, an hour south of Los Angeles. So
sure. So it's getting pretty chilly.
Yeah, at that point it's definitely starting to get one of those. We're thinking about swimming around the whole pier, and then I was like, I'm not a swimmer, I'm a runner, and so I'm like, the temperatures might be a bit too cool at that point, and you got to fumble with a wetsuit and stuff. So we're just gonna do it shorter.
Man, I can point people to the video because obviously you go into great depth. But before we hit record, we were talking about the impact that Lawrence Van Lingen had on your running. It's quite amazing to watch him taking the running world by storm in the field that he's in. Like he's a lot broader than just running movement. I was looking at his beautifully new designed website the other day and got a bit more of an overarching picture of what it is that he's actually doing. But Matt, I'd love to hear about that relationship a little bit more, or at least tell, because you mentioned Andy Blow sort of put you in touch with him or told you to go and catch up with him, and then. I think that video was really popular, and he actually mentioned it on my podcast how it was cool how you opened up and got emotion. You just had a moment where you're like, "Hey, this is amazing!" Like I felt great, I felt awesome.
Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting thing. So Lawrence Van Lingen, he's a movement specialist from South Africa. He used to live here in Southern California, where I first met him. Currently lives in Boulder. He has several different podcast guests and several different listeners to the show had told me I should connect with him, and I did. Andy Blow was one of our mutual friends who connected us. And once I met him and I started working with him, he's a physical therapist as well. So when I had certain niggles, like right before, like I had a few back-to-back marathons, Berlin, Tokyo, with some other adventures that I was doing in between. And sometimes my body was pretty tight and tense, and he was able to work on me and help me tremendously that way. But it went much beyond that through some of his movement techniques with the flow rope and the awesomizer and different things that he talks about on his channels. And so eventually I feel like I got to a place where I learned to improve some of my running form due to some of the things that we had worked on together. And that was very helpful, to a point that I started running much more with an open chest and much less pressure and much more with an open heart and posterior chain and anterior chain. We went into much of that part. And yeah, I started noticing certain improvements in my running where I started feeling much more relaxed, to a point that I thought I'd been running for a decade, that I knew how to run. And I think the part of, we sometimes get so busy in our everyday life, like, and there's so much like kind of on the go, that a lot of us are living in a constant state of stress, even when we don't realize it, even when we think we're pretty in tune with our bodies. When we actually really take the time to slow down and we really take the time to do some breath work, we do some meditation, some journaling, some of these things that we know are good for us, and we just push it out very often. And so it ended up getting to a point that I went for a run one day, and I had this super happy feeling, like a complete emotional breakthrough. Like I started crying, and I've had it a few times before, like at the end of a race where I would get emotional, where you've really you battled hard and you get to the end of a marathon and you're like, wow, but it really felt like I was starting to get more and more in tune with my emotions, but also some of the emotions would just come out more naturally sometimes. And at one point I'd had a session with Lawrence a few days prior, and I just had this breakthrough in my running that it felt like an effortless run. Everything just felt really good. I was feeling really happy and alive. And I just recorded a video, just like a video, like selfie mode, to Lawrence, basically saying like, oh, this was the best run of my life. I don't know what just happened. And I was bawling. And so when I started the interview I recorded a long form interview with him, and like the video starts with that, which is one of my most, it's not easy to put yourself on YouTube crying in front of a bunch of strangers. Meaning like I'm actually pretty personal. I don't post a whole lot of stuff. Like I'm the worst freaking social media person there is in the world. As in, I don't ever freaking post stuff on Instagram or wherever else. I just interview people I find interesting, record a long form podcast, and just put on YouTube. And so when I put that out there, it was pretty vulnerable, but I think it resonated with some people that they have either also experienced certain breakthroughs in their running over time, or they've also noticed that there's ways for them to improve. And so I think these are kind of the interesting conversations to have on these podcasts, where you just realize, as much as you think you know everything, sometimes it's good to experiment with different techniques or something that might resonate with you at a different stage in your life than it did a few years ago. So but that was wonderful, and I'm really happy to see that more and more people are experiencing some of the teachings that Lawrence has provided as well, and some of the, like, he puts a tremendous amount of videos on his YouTube channel and on his Instagram and on his community and whatnot. So that's good.
I was pretty lucky. Like I got involved in running when I was 13. I probably had my first competitive race outside like little athletics as a young kid. And I got to about 15. I moved from the west coast of Australia back to the east coast of Australia. And I happened to just get in touch with a running coach here. His name was Joe Carmody. He's probably 78 at the time. Like, he was old. I remember getting down to the athletics track, and I saw him doing strides on the back straight, and he looked so smooth, and he looks. I went down to him, and he came up. He's a real character. He always reminded me of Prefontaine's coach, Bill Bauman, just in the way that he looked and his demeanor a little bit. And the first thing he said to me, he came up, and I literally had never met him before. And he goes, do you know how old I am? And I go, no. He's like, I'm 78. And I go, hey. He goes, do you know what time I just did that 100 in? And I was like, what? And he's like, 14 seconds. I don't know if he was telling me the truth. And he goes, do you think I look good doing it? I said, actually, yeah, you did. He goes, that's where we're going to start with you. We're going to start with movement. And it was literally like, oh, after that, hi, I'm Tyson. And then it was such a shock to the system for me, because until that point, the say 18 months or 2 years, maybe a little more, that I'd been involved in competitive running, no one had mentioned technique. And I wasn't a smooth runner. I looked ugly when I run, especially when I was fatigued and stressed and, in a really hard battle. And he said a lot of the time you'll look at a smooth mover and you'll assume that they're just lucky enough to be a smooth mover. But it is strange, in the running world, that's often assumed. But when it comes to like tennis and golf and swimming especially, it's like the first point of call. And it's strange. I've got a friend who runs a company called Effortless Swimming. Really great swimming coach, great guy, great at what he does. But what's cool about it is he can make adjustments in your technique, and you'll go out and swim 100 meters that day and you'll swim at 4 seconds faster. And I think the frustrating thing with running, it's similar to golf, is you might get the golf instructor sit you down and go, hey, all right, here's the new technique, and walk you through it. And you just start spraying balls, and it feels unnatural, and it feels a little awkward, and you don't know what to do with your hands. And I always felt the same with running. Joe would always point out points of tension in my body and what it means and how it affects my stride and like the overall impact of that. And I'm like, yeah, but when I do what you're saying, I feel yuck. And he's like, please, he goes, I'm 78. Just give it a couple of years. And I still apply a heap of the cues that he offered me. And I still catch myself making the same mistakes when I'm out there running after 25 years of running, feeling my neck get tight, feeling my back get stressed, and just coming back to like a couple of little release cues. And I know for a fact it's enhanced how I feel when I run, not only my times, but it seems to be an obstacle that a lot of runners don't want to leap over. It's like, all right, there's not an immediate impact. So what's the point of doing it?
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's hard to see the bigger picture too, meaning if you are in a relaxed state yourself, if your nervous system is calm, typically your running will improve too, or your running will become smoother and easier. Like very often when you look at athletes at the end of a race, they're tensing up a lot, especially when you hang out at mile 20, 32K in. You just see people's fists, you see their shoulders up, you see where all you have to do at that point is actually try to relax, try to remove some of the tension in the body, and the running will go easier. But that can happen in training runs too, where we don't realize some of the tension that we hang on to in our bodies. Very many people are not aware of it. And I think the more that we, like Lawrence also talks about some of the breath work, like we've been doing breath work for years, and the impact, you can directly impact your nervous system by just calming it down that way. And it doesn't require you to do a whole lot of long exercise, even just 1 or 2 minutes of deliberate breathing, whether it's box breathing or one of these other techniques. Like, don't force it, just naturally slowing down from time to time can make a big difference.
Such a good reminder. I've completely blanked on the name of the book, but Dan Brule, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that name. He's like a breathwork coach.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
I should tell you the name of this because it's such a great book. Like he's been around for a little while, but I was listening through that and just being reminded of a number of things that you sort of just said about just taking the time to just breathe, like aptly named. And he essentially he walks through all of the like the breathing techniques that he works through with his clients. And yeah, he said a lot of the time people will be tense without even recognizing the fact that tension's there. And this relates so nicely to running. And one thing I often say with the athletes I work with is even if you can just focus throughout the day on noticing certain points of stress, like and noticing the impact that has on your body, whether it's your physique or your breath or a combination of both. Because I find it easier if I'm in tune or in a bit of a routine, just stopping by throughout the day and doing what you say, checking in. It's so much easier when you're under stress in running to notice that it's crept in. It's not just a further exasperated state of what your day looked like.
Yeah, and I think even little things, right? Like let's say you've had a busy work day and you're going for a run. I used to be very much like, let's put on my running shoes and go. And now it's like, all right, let's put on the running shoes and walk for a few minutes and then like just ease into the run. And just that transition from like being in go, go, go work mode to like actually going for a run. I've had it many times that I would start my run really like quickly. My heart rate would just shoot up and it'd be pretty unstable at that time. Whereas like if I just take my time to like warm up for a little bit and like, yes, I'll be the first to admit that I'm not the one who is like doing a gazillion mobility exercise before I start. Like, yes, when I do a high intensity run, I'll like do a little bit more of a deliberate warm up. But for every run, I typically really try to ease into it. And for me, walking for a few minutes before I start like jogging and picking up the pace is just these little things that can make a difference. So.
Yeah. Man, I was going through your website the other day and I was just reading through some of the testimonials of athletes that you've helped through your PB program. It's always cool just to hear about the individuals that have been impacted. Like I'll sometimes ask an athlete that I've coached just for the website, you know what I mean? Like a little bit of PR just to say, hey, like what's the experience been like? And sometimes reading through the positive feedback that they share, it's like, like this has actually made a really cool impact. And it's fun to do for yourself for like your own ego, but it's also cool to see it from, the perspective of what you've done. So the PB program, man, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I can imagine there'd be plenty of people who listen who'd be interested in finding out more. I had a look through the course set up and what's included, and like it seems like a really holistic approach to training.
It really is. So the basic fundamentals, it really comes down to like heart rate based training programs, which was purely all the training schedules I wrote for myself when I started out with this. Like I was really into some of the different books out there. But even when I looked at, for example, Dr. Phil Methadone, there were no training schedules there. Like I experimented with a lot of different training schedules, and I actually ended up developing what I found to work well for me. And then we started working with several different athletes over the years, and we fine-tuned things as we went. So it's a bunch of different training schedules. It's a lot of different videos that talk through how to implement different things within your training, how to get the mindset in the right spot. We spent actually at the beginning quite a few videos on how to get into the right mindset, how to set up the right habits, how to get yourself to a point that why are you doing this, and in what sort of way can you set yourself up that you can sustain things over a longer period of time. I do often see people trying to rush through things and right away wanting to get through like, just give me the training schedules, and then from there on I'm just gonna. It's so much more than that. Everything is connected. And so I think like spending time in all of the different areas that help you improve holistically as a runner, that's been an important one. And like you were saying earlier, like I think to me this has never been a thing for like, let's do this for the money. Like for me, this has surely been like when I experienced at the beginning of my running journey, like this aha moment of like getting so much joy out of my running. I was like, I want more people to know about this. That's why I started the podcast. That's why I started these free Facebook groups early on. This is purely like to bring people together and share similar experiences. And so over time, like this just naturally grew into something bigger. And it's been really fun to see like the transitions that people are making from like, I tried to qualify for the Boston Marathon for 8 years, and now finally I was able to break through. Or like I've been injured for a long period of time, and now for the first time in my life, I feel like I've rediscovered the joy of running again. Like that was me early on, and now it's so wonderful to see other people experiencing that as well. So.
Yeah, it must be wild, like looking back at the last 12 years and just seeing how big the podcast has got. Because, I mean, not to blow your ties up too much, but like in the world of running, I don't know that there's many podcasts, especially on YouTube, that are sort of reaching as many people. Every episode that you put up seems to get a good bit of traction.
It is fun to see. Like I don't have that many episodes on YouTube. I think we're at like this is episode number 90. And so, like, yes, I've had a lot of offline conversations, and we've had like 500 video Zoom recordings within the P3 program alone. So those are all, we'll have guest speakers coming in there, we'll have separate workshops and stuff. So that's all offline. But then I think the topics that we cover like seem to resonate with people, and like we just have fun doing it. And I think if you're in it for the right reason and you have these conversations, like it naturally gets to the right audience. So.
Yeah, it's really cool, man. Dude, well, I'm not gonna eat into your afternoon too much more. It was a conversation that I was pumped to have with you, brother. I've been looking forward to it since I can't remember when I reached out, but you said you're a flat out at the moment because you had your head into the book that you're writing, and I fully appreciated that. But yeah, I was excited to wake up this morning and see we had the chance to meet, brother. So yeah, really big fan of your work, as so many other thousands of people. And dude, thanks heaps for coming on, mate. It really means a lot.
I appreciate you having me on. And if you ever end up visiting Los Angeles over here, where are you located in Australia?
I'm in Melbourne. I'm in a little coastal town about 90 minutes outside of Melbourne. My town's called Point Lonsdale. But brother, I've got my wife's brother lives in Oregon, and we're over there regularly enough. So next time I'm there, I mean, it's not that long a drive in the context of how big Australia is and where we drive to here, so I can come down and say g'day, or at least catch a flight.
Yeah, no, that'll be great. And like, if I end up running the Sydney Marathon, I'll take the family down to Melbourne as well. I used to live for 9 months in Melbourne, way back in the day. I lived in Malvern. I used to work for this company, Simplot. They were doing like Bird's Eye. They were doing like the the meat pies 4 and 20 and all these like there was like so yeah, we're eating a lot of meat pies out there. So
that's so funny. I think Malvern's where they've got like a lot of the big outlets as well, isn't it? Like got like the Adidas outlet and things like that. Yeah, I used to do all my shopping out there back in the day. I know exactly what you mean. I got friends there, man. Yeah, small world, hey?
It really, really is. So yeah.
All right, brother.
Sure.
Thanks again, man.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a good one.